Last week we talked about what happens when we run out of wine. And we used wine as a metaphor for spirit. What happens when our life's energy runs down? When we lose our sense of purpose, our hope that is essential for living? What do? We looked at this story as a metaphor. Now, we come to the part about the water. And now we're at our crunch point. Okay? And I want to tell you two different paths of this story. This has traditionally been interpreted as Jesus' first miracle, where he changes physically the water into physically the wine. We listen to the story, we take it literally, and we say, wow, isn't Jesus something? That's the one path we can go through. And we can go down that. We've been talking about ourselves as a progressive church with a progressive theology. And it's characteristic of progressive theology that Jesus is not half divine, half superpower, and half human. It is a characteristic of progressive theology that Jesus is a human being who models in his life the ability to have a relationship with God that allows his spiritual life to be so expansive that people are inspired, that people say, he has something special. He can work miracles. And so, this is the fork in the road that is before us today. For if it is Jesus who turns literally the water into wine, then we say, isn't he great? And we worship him, but we do not think we are like him, because he has superpowers we don't have. If we walk down the other road and say that Jesus is a human being who in this situation transformed something that everybody said, wow, that's a miracle. But if he's like us, and if it is through his close relationship with God that is both found in his desire to withdraw and his rich prayer life, as well as his practice of walking among people and hearing what their real needs are, and coming up with innovative ways to address them. Well, if that is who we see Jesus as, then we each have the capacity to be like Jesus. Do you see that? So, I fall on the side that says, let's see, if Jesus is a human being like us, and if I have the capacity, if I can kind of learn from him and see his ways as a path for me to follow, then maybe I can bring a Jesus light into various situations. So I want to just think about this story as if Jesus is a human being without superpowers, but someone who is like me, like you, and who gains his power through his deep connection. See? God is already protesting. Or maybe sending a word of encouragement. Keep going, Cheryl. So, let's look at this story. The host of the feast, of the wedding feast, is at his wits' ends. He doesn't know what to do because he's going to be socially embarrassed. And we don't hear anything more about him. So he's at the place, perhaps, of stillness, just getting ready to hold his head and say, I'm embarrassed. Or perhaps he's paralyzed. I don't know what to do. God, let this feast get over soon so that my guests will go home. But if this is a story that has a spiritual lesson that is not that, then we have Mary coming to Jesus and saying, hey, we have to do something. I've heard that the host is running out of wine, that the host wants all the guests to just go home. We've got to do something because this situation needs to be transformed. Jesus has an argument with Mary, so the story goes. And then, as you do when you're still a young adult, eventually the mom wins. And he looks around and he says, we are going to have to do things differently if we're going to redeem this situation. What resources do we have already that could be repurposed, reimagined, where we could pivot their use, the way we see them, so that we can redeem this situation. And so his eye goes to these 6 jugs, urns, that are set aside for the rite of purification. And if this is a metaphor, he says, you know what? The purification that's been so big in the past as a practice, it's not as important as redeeming this situation. And so I'm going to repurpose these jugs. And through his repurposing of just the ordinary things, the situation is redeemed, and he sees, or people see him as a miracle worker. Now let's move away from that story, because otherwise we'll still try to take it literally. I was intrigued to be thinking about this week when the royal family is having to reimagine the family configuration and the way they have always done things. You know, all the Queen's children are in the family firm, or they have been until Andrew's fall from grace. Right? She could count on them. It was a family firm. With Harry and Meghan saying, you know what? We see this differently. We think there is a different and a higher calling for us, a different calling. And they have had to reimagine how they will organize the family firm. That's an example. There are other examples. How many have seen Frozen 2? Okay. I was so eager to get there, I had to sit in the kids section in Indian Head, Saskatchewan. I don't want to give a spoiler alert, but when I look out, it may be that not a lot more of you are going to go to Frozen 2. I recommend it. But they are confronted by a situation that they've never been confronted by before. Elsa and Anna are the 2 sisters. I recommend this movie highly. But they are confronted by a situation that they've never been confronted with before. And they have to go into the forest to find what to do in this new way of being. And at a point, they become totally lost. And they do not know what to do. And then Pabby, who is the leader of the trolls, who they wouldn't necessarily have listened to previously, Pabby says, when one can see no future, all one can do is the next right thing. Elsa says, the next right thing is for me to go to the enchanted forest and find that voice. Christoph says, well, I'm not very comfortable with the idea of that. He'd like things to not change. Anna, Elsa's sister, says, well, you're not going alone. This spiritual practice of seeing that the ordinary and the familiar is no longer requires that we think differently about all the resources that we have before us. And when we cannot see the end result, perhaps it is not bad advice to hear from Pabby, the leader of the trolls. When you can't see the future, all you can do is to do the next right thing, to take the next right step. Jesus doesn't know, as does every human being. You don't know how your future is going to unfold. You don't know where you're going to be led, what situations you're going to find yourself in, what burdens and blessings are going to come into your life. We don't know that as a church. We don't know it as individuals. We sure don't know it as a society right now. I think this passage leads us to say, no superpower is going to come and do a miracle and make things like they were. It is going to be to every person who feels a connection with a higher power, a greater source of love, a higher purpose, to take the next right step, to do the next right action, to use what is the ordinary things in life that we've just taken for granted, to see them differently, to repurpose them, to have a spiritual courage to see with new eyes. And as we do that, and as we engage ourselves in the next step, well, we'll almost feel drunk with the giddiness of saying, wow, we can make a difference. We can be agents of change and hope. We can somehow turn around and redeem situations. So I think Paul led us to the crucial point. The days of using the water for purification are over. Now water will be used for a different purpose, to reinvigorate, just as Jesus, this human being with this exceptionally close relationship with a power greater than himself, will do things differently. And in that, He will help us all see the blessings we have and the capacity we have to transform and change and use differently. Well, I'll be interested to hear which view of Jesus you each have. Thank you for listening. Amen.